Professor Jayati Ghosh, Professor of Economics at UAMS, Hermeshead, co-chair Independent Commission of the Reform of International Corporate Taxation, also a former professor of JNU, with more than 3 decades of teaching at the JNU, former Executive Secretary of Ideas, also now currently is serving on several international commissions, including Extraordinary of Inequality, South Africa G20 President. Professor Gabriel Porcile, Professor of Faculty of Social Science, the University of the Republic at Montevideo, Uruguay, former Professor of Economics at Universidade Federal do Paraná, former Economic Affairs Officer at the UN ECLAC in Montevideo, and a former Director of ECLAC Office in Montevideo. We have also in this roundtable with Professor Marta Castillo, Professor as Associate Professor Institute of Economics at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, Deputy Director of Postgraduate Studies at University Federal of Rio de Janeiro, Coordinator of Industry and Competitiveness Group, GIC, at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, and now is the Chief Editor of Journal of Contemporary Economics. At least my colleague, Luisa Nassif Pires. Luisa is a professor at Institute of Economics and Associate Research at CESIT and PAGU at the University of Campinas, co-director of Research Center on Macroeconomics of Inequality, MADI USP, at the University of São Paulo, member and board of directors of IAFI, and associate research in gender equality and economic program at Levy Economics Institute at Bard College. So we're going to maintain the order that was passed to me. We start following this order with Professor Jayati Ghosh.
Thank you so much. It's a great delight to be part of this panel, and I'm also really delighted to be with these specific people who are here. Mine is really quite descriptive, and it's more a kind of international background on what's going on with taxation and why there's a lot of easy stuff that we could be doing, low-hanging fruit, really, even within the current broadly neoliberal framework, which doesn't happen for various reasons. I mean, I think the fact that we need tax reform is obvious. There's been so much discussion about how we need public revenues, that all this billions to trillions stuff of mobilizing private finance hasn't worked. And so we obviously need to massively increase public revenues, right? And basically, the immediate goal is to, I would say, to raise the revenues that are currently lost due to the international architecture. So it's not even just about the domestic political economy that is preventing us from getting ahead with more taxation. It is the global rules of taxation, which, remember, were formulated about a century ago when you didn't really have the same kind of multinational activity that you have today, and where you didn't have the tax havens that you have today, where the rich of every country can salt away their money in particular places. So you have, obviously, the inadequate taxation of the very rich. The technical term now is the high net worth individuals. And a lot of this is enabled by the ways in which financial transactions occur, the illicit financial flows, and the fact that you can have all these secrecy jurisdictions where you can stash your funds, basically. Then, of course, there's the entirely legal tax avoidance by multinationals. It's not necessarily that they are always doing it illegally. In fact, increasingly, there is legal tax avoidance by multinationals, which is enabled by this very broken tax system that I mentioned earlier. And of course, in addition to that, there's the illicit stuff. And that's both by companies and individuals. Illegal as well as the illicit. And all of this in a world where, because of mobile capital, there is constant pressure on governments to lower their tax rates. And thereby you lose domestically. Even if you want to have higher tax rates, You're constantly told that this is not going to attract foreign investment, that you will get capital flow outside, and so on. So, and the rich people say, oh, you're going to tax us more, we will move, and so on, right? These are the standard answers that governments always give us when we say, well, why aren't you raising, let's say, the corporate tax rate, or the tax rate on wealth, or the tax rate on incomes of very high net worth individuals. It's very important when we're raising money for climate finance that we are not going for taxes that are inherently regressive. And yesterday there was a lot of discussion on carbon taxes. I'm not going to go into that, but let's note that they are inherently regressive, okay? That they in fact add to the burden on working people and on poorer regions of the world. And they also intensify the inequalities between rich countries. Definitely the Inflation Reduction Act and the carbon border adjustment measures of the US and the EU respectively are in that category. They are largely protectionist, especially because they're not accompanied, forget financial flows, they're also not accompanied by any technology transfers that would enable firms in these countries to actually meet the standards that are set to avoid the tariffs. So there is that problem. Global tax and dividend policies, there's a reason why pretty much all developing country governments are skeptical. Because the experience with global funds is very bad so far. Tax collection is inevitably national, and there's no guarantee, in fact, there's no chance, let's face it, that the taxes that you collect through all of this green stuff is going to be shared across countries. The global funds story has been very bad because the funds that are actually democratic in terms of how they allocate resources don't get any money from the rich countries. And the funds that do get a little bit, a tiny trickle of money, whether it's the IMF's RST or various other of these funds, are heavily controlled, and typically they're conditional in what the funds that the money that they provide. And then they're tiny and slow, and they don't really give much money. So even the loss and damage fund has really been a bit of a non-starter. I won't say, it's too early to say failure, but it certainly hasn't got off the ground in the way that the countries that proposed it to begin with wanted it. So we absolutely have to think of progressive tax reform. And that would use the fact that we have all these loopholes and say, well, okay, we have to plug those loopholes in the global tax system. That's really the purpose. And one of the big ones is the tax avoidance by multinational corporations. The estimates vary depending on who's doing the estimate. Our own estimate from the Independent Commission on the Reform of International Corporate Taxation is in the range of 250 billion, but there are other estimates that go up to 460 billion per year. That is lost in terms of lost tax revenues. It's true, most of this goes to the rich country. I mean, the loss is mostly in the rich countries because they are the ones where most of the economic activity occurs. But relative to GDP, and relative to budgets, it's actually worse for low and middle income countries. So in fact, we are actually worse off because our revenue sources are also more limited. Typically, we have a greater reliance on corporate income tax, and yet we are unable to raise the basic income tax that multinationals that operate in all our countries actually generate. So the point is this, which is that, we are dealing with multinational companies that have one business model. I mean, they're one company, right? Apple is one company, Amazon is one company. They have one set of shareholders. They have one set of annual reports. Yet in each country, they are treated for tax purposes as a separate entity. And it's this arm's length behavior that enables what is called base erosion and profit shifting. So basically, Apple in India can say, well, yes, I'm making all these revenues, but I don't really have profits because all these revenues are going to pay for intellectual property rights that are held in Dublin, Ireland, which is a tax haven, or some other royalty payment, or some interest that I have to give to another Apple subsidiary from which I have taken a completely unnecessary loan. But I've taken this loan, so I have to pay all this interest, et cetera, et cetera. So you end up with zero taxable profits in India. And so this thing, which is called base erosion and profit shifting, has been recognized. And in fact, the OECD, after massive lobbying from various organizations, finally accepted this principle that you have to treat it as one company. And the idea is quite simple, that Apple is one global company. So the global profits of Apple have to be allocated across countries for taxing rights. So you take a formula. Our suggested formula is 60% profit, 40% employment, to get a sense of the economic activity in that country. And you say, well, okay, Apple's global profits are this much. India's share of their global profits for taxable purposes, based on that formula, would be so much. So we will tax that amount the same as we tax our domestic companies. That's all. So we are not saying we're going to tax them higher. We're simply saying they will now pay the same rate as our domestic companies. Currently, all of these digital companies pay next to no tax in India, okay? Except for the digital services tax, which I come to, which is a kind of response to the fact that we couldn't do this other thing. The current rules also, because even when the principle was agreed, they did all kinds of tweaks in the system. I won't give you all the details because it will take too long. But essentially, even with a system like this, the home countries get the biggest share of the tax from the global profits. And then you have the tax competition, which I mentioned already. Okay, so here is an estimate from Gabriel Zuckman and his colleagues at the EU Tax Observatory. And this is the amount of profits shifted to tax havens. That's the blue line. As you can see, it's been rising dramatically from the 1990s onwards, really zoomed after 2010. And the amount of associated tax revenue loss, they're on different axes, right? So this is, the left axis is telling you about the proportion of global corporate taxes that is shifted to havens. And the orange line is telling you the proportion of corporate tax revenue loss to total corporate income taxes. And you can see how they've kind of stayed at a high level. They stagnated at that high level due to two major changes. There was the whole process of initiating the base erosion and profit shifting thing that in 2015, which went on for a very long time and has now died because the US has anyway said that they're not going to accept it and so on. But then there was the US, which in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, that's Trump won, okay? But they actually introduced for US companies this thing called GILTI, which was effectively a kind of reverse taxation, where their multinational corporations based in the US were taxed on all of their incomes outside, in a kind of minimum tax type of framework. So the idea would be this, that you have this allocation, this formulary apportionment as it's called, of profits across all the countries, and you have a global minimum tax rate, because otherwise there will still be an incentive for some jurisdictions to kind of create lots of tax incentives. So you have a minimum tax rate so that if some country is charging really low taxes, 12%, 10%, etc., you can make up the difference if you can show that there was economic presence in your own country. Why is this important? Well, some tax havens are very well known. Everybody knows all the islands, right? We have Panama Papers and all the different papers, etc., telling us that it's all these Caribbean islands that are tax havens. And certainly the British Virgin Islands, which are under British jurisdiction, let's be clear, are among the big tax havens. But there are also lots of others. Puerto Rico is under US jurisdiction. And then you have Ireland, Luxembourg, Hong Kong, Singapore, Switzerland, Netherlands. Now, how do you know the tax havens? Well, here is the pre-tax corporate profits, that's the orange bar, as a percentage of the compensation for employees for multinationals. Blue bar is for local firms. So the profitability conditions of the local economy are given to you by the blue bars. And the orange bar is telling you how much profits the multinational is getting. So you get some idea that clearly a lot of economic activities is essentially being shifted to these. But of course, the biggest tax havens are not these islands, as I've mentioned. They're the UK's crown dependencies. But then the United States actually has a lot of really important tax havens. And that's because they have a federal system of tax, and they have taxes. The federal taxes are relatively low for corporate income tax. The states have their own corporate taxes, and Nevada, Delaware, South Dakota, and Wyoming and Florida are really big ones. Some of these have no income taxes at all, either personal or corporate. And so they are really major tax havens. Biden comes from Delaware, I will remind you. There's one particular building, this is the picture of that building, 1209 North Orange Street in Wilmington, which is actually Joe Biden's town. It was this little building here had 285,000 separate businesses in 2012. So it's not even like a mailbox. I don't think a mailbox would fit in there. I'm not quite sure how they fit 285,000 in this two-story building, but there you have it. So you get a sense of the problem. And of course, here's another way of showing the problem. I don't know if you can see this at all. The left graph is where the affiliates of multinationals have the highest ratio of recorded profits per employee. You know that number that I showed you? And the right side is in terms of who has the effective tax rates. And you can see they are mirror images of each other, right? The jurisdictions with the lowest tax rates have the highest rate of recorded profits per employee, and the other way around for the countries with higher tax rates. Mind you, when we're saying high, it's not that high, yeah? There's still pretty low effective tax rates, but still you get this massive indication that multinational companies are just doing this on a very regular basis. So what do you do? Well, as I said, our commission suggests that you have a global minimum effective tax rate. So we suggested 25% because that is the median of global corporate tax rates. Half the countries in the world, mostly low and middle income countries, have tax rates higher than that. Janet Yellen in 2021 suggested 21%. That still would have been okay, right? And of course, you combine that with what I have called formulary apportionment. You tax a company according to its global profits based on your recognition of its economic activity in terms of sales and employment in your own country, okay? So you get a proportion of the global profits to tax. And you tax it. By the way, this is not some crazy idea thought up by a bunch of crazy economists. This is the way the US tax system works. The US, because of this federal thing that I told you about, has that ability to actually, they do it only on sales, but the US tax system is based entirely on formulary apportionment across the states as well. So this was, in fact, Pillar 1, and Pillar 1 was first pushed by the US because they wanted other countries to get rid of the digital services taxes, which many of them had brought in, because they could not tax Amazon and Apple and so on any other way. So they just put a turnover tax, 2 to 5%, depending on which country. To get rid of that, the US multinationals had lobbied to get this into the OECD. And the Pillar 1 that was proposed was pretty horrible, actually, because as I told you, there was all this, anywhere between 240 to 500 billion lost in tax revenues. But they said, all of that is not to be considered for sharing. Only profit rates above 10%. Now, why suddenly only profit rates above 10%? No corporate tax system in the world says we will only tax profits above 10% rate. Makes no sense, right? So that already reduces it dramatically. Then they say of that small amount above 10%, and only the largest multinationals, so only about 100 multinationals, of that small amount, only a quarter of it will be available for distribution. So you go from, let's say 250 billion to about 9 billion in terms of the shared taxable revenue. It's a dramatic drop. And of course, of that 9 billion, developing countries will get nothing, in return for which you have to get rid of the digital service tax. The other one, the minimum tax rate, was actually accepted. And a whole bunch of countries signed on to it, okay? Including the US, but then of course now they walked out of it. But as I said, we'd suggested 25, Janet Yellen suggested 21, the lobbying by Singapore, Ireland, and multinationals brought it down to 15, which is close to the Ireland tax rate of 12.5. It's a kind of, but then they added all these carve-outs for economic substance. So once again, here is an estimation from the OECD, the EU Tax Observatory. So the blue bar is how much tax you would have collected altogether, all countries, if you had stuck to even that low rate of 15%. But then the first one is 20%. So it's a reasonable, it's about 10% of global corporate profits you would get from this. But then they first brought it down to 15%. So that's the first decline. As you can see, that first orange bar coming down. So it comes down to just about half of what it would have been. And then you add other carve-outs, okay? A whole range of carve-outs. There's a carve out for economic substance, which means you have to show you have employment. Suddenly, I don't know any of you who live near a tax haven, you will find that suddenly Google and all kinds of companies have opened offices there. In various tax havens, Luxembourg, Brussels, et cetera, they're all full of offices with actual people in them. Earlier, so you don't get the Delaware situation. You have maybe 50, maybe 100, maybe even 1,000 employees physically present. You get exemptions for US multinationals. Sorry, not UN multinationals. That's a typo. United States multinationals managed to get exemptions. That's the third decline. And then you get refundable tax credits. All this before Trump, by the way. So, I don't know why Trump bothered walking out of this, because the amount that you go from about 16% of global corporate taxes being available through this route to about 2%. So significant decline. There is one success. So, finally some good news. One of the things that happened was the automatic sharing of banking information. 142 countries have signed on to this. The US has not, of course, although the US demands that any taxpayer in the US provides details of all of its financial transactions everywhere else. But nonetheless, 142 countries have actually signed on, which is quite significant. And it's significant, why? Because, even personal wealth, this is offshore wealth, which is part corporations, but also a lot of personal, the high net worth individuals. Yeah. And you can see that Switzerland used to be the big guy, no longer, because Asian offshore centers have taken over. Singapore was always known, but Dubai is the new big one. Okay. And American offshore centers are relatively low in this. European also exist, and they're important, but they have been declining to some extent. But what's very interesting is to look at the decline on the right side. This is, in fact, the benefit of this automatic sharing of banking information, as you can see. So the blue line is all the unreported, all the offshore wealth, I'm sorry. The orange line is the reported financial wealth, okay, untaxed. This is all the estimate of offshore wealth is the blue line, okay? Can you see the dotted line on the right? Yeah, that dotted line is when you got the automatic exchange of banking information. And what you find is that the untaxed share of this significant offshore wealth has declined very dramatically. Okay, so that's actually a sign that it does make a difference. The fact that this is being reported does allow countries to track and tax previously unreported wealth. Okay, and that, in fact, then leads to much greater potential for wealth tax. Now, as I've shown you, in fact, it's come down, but it's still 25% of offshore wealth which is untaxed. And of course, it's also true that we don't know, because not all the offshore financial institutions comply with the reporting requirements, and the US still doesn't give any information to any other country. And of course, this is only financial assets. It doesn't talk about real estate. Dubai is a big one. 27% of Dubai real estate is owned by foreigners, mainly Indians, okay? And of course, there are many loopholes for tax evasion, as we know, especially because of not just tax havens, but secrecy jurisdictions, which really keep your wealth tightly wrapped in terms of nobody knowing, and the use of shell companies and trusts. But if we could, even on the existing known offshore wealth, if we put in a very low wealth tax, and this again is Gabriel Zucman's estimate, 2% will generate 250 billion annually. From less than 3,000 people, billionaires only. Okay? If you bring in centimillionaires, which makes a lot of sense in our countries because we don't all have that many billionaires, then you get significantly more, especially in less developed countries. This is why the negotiations at the UN, which are ongoing thanks to the Group of Africa, are very significant. So these negotiations are, first of all, to a framework convention on international tax cooperation, which will include the potential for doing a lot of these things, as well as to what are called early harvest protocols. One of them is about cross-border services, and a lot of it is really about digital service taxation. Currently, some countries just put in a kind of 2%, 3% on the turnover of these digital service companies because there's no other way of grasping that money. President Trump has used that, has really fought against that. And many of the trade deals that he has come to, I don't know about signing, but whatever, he's declared, have involved countries giving up on their digital services. So it's good to have a UN protocol that would actually enable this to happen. And tax disputes is another one, because the big multinationals are really experts in bringing tax disputes under, a whole range of international agreements, including bilateral investment agreements and other trade agreements, economic partnership agreements. Sorry, I'm 2 minutes, right? Okay. This is also critical for combating illicit financial flows, because you have to coordinate the data collection. You can't do it otherwise. Country by country reporting of the multinationals has already helped, but it's not enough. Shell companies, shadow companies, these are trusts. These are the big ones. And these are really hard to grasp because of all the secrecy jurisdictions. But you can still do this, and you can coordinate strategies to identify trade misinvoicing, for example. But it's not easy, right? And most of our countries don't have the technical capacities and the ability to handle all of this. That's why an international protocol would definitely help. At the moment, it's not just the fact that the global architecture leaves out a lot of stuff, they also bring in a lot of stuff. As I said, the bilateral investment treaties and all of these things, they all have investor-state dispute settlement clauses, and those are always used to bring cases against governments that try and tax the multinationals. And they can get away with it because there are very, very broad definitions of investment and expropriation. And the case law that we have almost always goes against governments. It's always in favor of the multinational corporations. If we had tax coordination that is global, we could actually supersede these kinds of agreements. We could say that they are not relevant and valid, and that would be a major kind of advance in the ability. So basically, you have to calibrate the architecture of dispute settlement, and I'm almost done. Basically, you can't do this. I mean, I think all of us have realized that pure multilateralism, in the sense of all countries coming to a consensus, isn't going to happen anytime soon. But you can actually develop coalitions. I think in Latin America, you already have the example of PT-LAC, the progressive taxation in Latin America and the Caribbean, which is a great initiative. And I think now there are 12 countries that are members of it. But it obviously can do more in terms of regional coordination. The Group of Africa has been really active in the UN, but I think there are now moves within the African Union to work together much more on tax coordination, and that again, and cooperation and exchange of information. The point about these, they're not just regional initiatives. They actually create a basis for a much more aggressive position in multilateral negotiations as well. If there are groups of countries that are successfully doing this, it actually creates a push for more countries to take this up. But obviously that means civil society has to be actively involved. And the thing about tax, you say taxation and people's eyes glaze over. They say, oh, tax, it's so boring and technical and don't get it. But in fact, it's deeply political and it's deeply urgent. So this is something that really needs to be disseminated much more within our societies. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Ghosh. We follow our order here with Professor Gabriel Porcile. It's your turn.
Okay, first of all, I would like to say thank you to the organizers. Unicamp is my alma mater, so I'm very happy to be here. I feel at home, and I'm super happy to participate in the seminar. Second, I will say sorry beforehand because I'm not an specialist in taxation. What I will try to do is to put the discussion of taxation and fiscal policy within the broader context of sustainable development. In this sense, I hope that my presentation will be complementary to the other presentations that we are attending today. I mean, sustainable development implies a growth path or a development path that is sustainable in three dimensions: economic, social, and environmental. I will define which means to be sustainable in these dimensions from a center-periphery point of view, from a structuralist point of view, which is to acknowledge that the international economy is characterized by very strong asymmetries that we have to take into account when we think of sustainable development. The economic sustainability is defined by the ability of the periphery to grow without an explosive external debt and without having to depend too heavily on capital inflows. And this means capabilities. This means reducing the technology gap. This means building endogenous technological capabilities in the periphery. There is a social dimension. Our economies are extremely unequal, and we need to reduce this inequality, eradicate poverty. So the social sustainability implies a very strong commitment to equality in the periphery. And the environmental dimension has to do with comply with the commitments we ourselves made in the national determined contributions, which is our contribution, so to say, to global sustainability within the common but differentiated responsibilities as regards climate change. All these conditions an impossible trinity. I will argue that these three conditions, the policies necessary to attain, to succeed in these three dimensions, are complementary. There are mutual reinforcements and positive feedbacks between them. It's not just trade-off. There are positive interactions that we should explore to be able to move in this type of development. But to take full advantage of these complementarities, no, the argument is that they are strategic complements, not strategic rivals, is to have a coordinated set of investments and articulate a package of articulated investments, as Camila argued yesterday, with the idea of a big push for sustainability. So this big push implies very heavy fiscal commitments, a very important role for state investment, for public investment, and this takes us to the big green state, a big democratic green state that Luis Fernando also suggested in his presentation. So the good thing to be in the last sessions is that you can build on the presentations of the other participants. Okay, so this is the challenge. It's a really big challenge, a political economy and capabilities, a challenge that the state should address in order to move in the direction of sustainable development. This is a citation from Beasley and Person. Probably you know these authors are quite orthodox, and the paper was published in Econometrica. It was deliberated, the idea of quoting orthodox economists, because sometimes tax and fiscal policies are the only, we can only see these demands by heterodox economists. But they argue that the question in taxation and development is, how does a government go from rising around 10% of GDP in taxes to rising around 40%? This is a major political economic challenge, and we cannot, that reminds us the Kaleski's argument that the fiscal policy is in a capitalist economy a very political, a difficult political topic, because capitalists don't like that the government decides where and how much to invest. And this is why orthodox economists are, as you know, usually more inclined to adopt monetary policies. What happened? Here. Okay. There was another slide, but it disappeared. It's okay. No, it's the one that tries to present the economic challenge of sustainability. And the graph shows the relative productivity of Latin America with respect to the USA and how it is going down, especially since the 80s. This one is a version of Martina Vélez Prebisch cross using the concepts of Keynesian efficiency and Schumpeterian efficiency. So you have on the y-axis the Schumpeterian efficiency, which is basically the share in total exports of high-tech sectors. High-tech sectors are defined in this graph as those sectors that have comparative advantage in patenting. I'm using data produced by Federico Riccio from the University of Pisa. But you can use different indicators of the technological intensity of exports. And on the x-axis is the Keynesian efficiency. It is related basically to the income elasticity of exports of the different sectors, of the different sectors in total exports. Two things, what the size of the circle are on the left, and the GDP per capita of some countries, and in the graph on the right is the GDP growth. And you see basically that both efficiencies are correlated. So if we want to avoid problems with the external constraint, we need to move towards more technologically intensive sectors, which are at the same time more dynamic in the global economy. So these two efficiencies co-evolve, and they are positively related. And this is the message that you can see from the success of many Asian countries that are represented in the graph. And you see that Latin America and the Caribbean, which is the point of view that I adopt in my discussion, is not doing very well. This is the challenge of building capabilities in the periphery. Why we need these capabilities? Well, we need these capabilities because if we want to prevent the dependence from capital inflows, we need these capabilities, but we also need them to innovate in the green technologies, to adopt the green technologies, and to transform our economies in a more sustainable direction. These things are interconnected. But also, a process of structural change absorbs people that is in sectors with very low productivity, in the subsistence sector, draws from these people from there to more decent jobs, to jobs with higher labor productivity. And this is an important part in the story of strengthening the power of labor in the labor market and improving skills and the wage share. But this is, I mean, if you think of the Lewis model in which there is a modern sector that pulls the workers from subsistence to, to modern activities, the engine here is a structural change. It's a transformation of the economy with Keynesian and Schumpeterian efficiency. Well, I see that it's a kind of trick to be sure that I will finish in time. But okay. The missing slide shows that the Gini coefficient in different countries after and before taxes and transfers. And one thing that one can see in this graph that Latin American countries do not redistribute income. The Gini changes a very few points in Latin America after tax and transfers. While in the OECD, in the European countries, in particular in the Nordic countries, the fall in the Gini is very significant. This is a political economy problem. This is not just structural change. This is not technology. This is really something that we have to deal with in political terms because it's a political decision, so to say. This graph is a graph that I like very much. You can say, I earn 20 times more than my neighbor because I'm very intelligent. And it's my merit to have this wonderful salary. Indeed, not so much. Perhaps your neighbor is 10 times more intelligent than you, but he comes from, or she comes from a very poor neighborhood or from a poor family. This graph is the correlation, basically, between the parents' income and the children income. It's a bit more sophisticated than that, the way in which it is calculated. But basically, it shows whether your income is related to the income of your parents. And you see that Finland, Denmark on the left, the correlation is not so high. Norway, Belgium, but when you go to the Latin American countries, which are the orange ones, and the color orange was not deliberated used in this graph. I just will tell you for for full disclosure. I mean, it's not with second intention. But the orange part is the more unequal and the more privileged and the more that shows the more levels of correlation, or persistence over time of poverty. We made some exercises in ECLAC, and more recently with some ECLAC friends. What could take to eliminate poverty in 2030? So we first tried just growth. Just growth does not eliminate poverty. We then assume a low rate of growth with income transfers. Basically, we are assuming here in the exercise with income redistribution that we take 3 points from the 10% the top income in Latin America, 3 points of the GDP of this group, and give them to the poor. And we see that just this kind of redistribution, which may seem a lot, but if you do this, you just make the Gini index of Latin America fall to the Gini index of Uruguay, which is not very good. So it's not really a revolution. So in the exercise, we need at least a 4% growth with this kind of income redistribution to eventually eliminate poverty in 2030. Well, sustainability, environmental sustainability, we assume that Latin America is committed to honor the promises it makes in the national determined contributions and ask ourselves, with the current trends in decarbonization, what would be the rate of growth consistent with the rate of with the promises we made in terms of decarbonization? And if the gray part of the graph shows the rate of growth consistent with the conditional target, which is 29% of fall in emissions. And you see that this would imply a negative rate of growth. This is and this gives an idea of the importance of the efforts we need to make in terms of technical change towards decarbonization if we would like to comply with the national determined contribution. This is not an imposition from the North. This is something that we promise. And if we don't change the production structure, the patterns of consumption and growth, we should be growing at a negative rate if we would like to reduce, as we promised, the emissions. I will go very quickly in the last slides. This is the gridlock that some sociologists suggested, in which the neoliberal policies had a negative impact on the domestic economy, leading to this xenophobic, fear-led globalization backlash that reduce this in turn lead to less international cooperation, which at the same time have a negative impact on the global climate change, etc. To escape the gridlock, very briefly, the Green Global New Deal in the international economy, something that UNCTAD have been suggesting and working on, are complemented with the national policies to unlock the economic and social transformation of the periphery in the shape of the big push that it was also discussed here. So this would create an environment, a domestic political environment that could be helpful to reshape somehow these international relations in a more cooperative way. The elephant in the room is financial globalization. And I will quote again UNCTAD, who used to talk about the revenge of the rentiers, which is a very good idea about what happened in the 70s and the rise of rentier capitalism in the 80s and 90s. And it's interesting because there is also a revenge, which is the one from Polanyi, who said that when if you let everything to the market will destroy nature and social relations to an extent that the very existence of the markets are under threat. So the problem is that Polanyi, the revenge of Polanyi, may take different forms, and the form, the way in which this is coming today is a very negative one. It's this xenophobic, authoritarian trends and the weakening of democracy that we are seeing almost everywhere. So it is necessary to accept this challenge, this political economy challenge, and think of building, as Jayati say, coalitions, international coalitions, domestic coalitions that could give the political support to the type of the new global New Deal and the a big push for sustainability. But this is a very difficult challenge. But I would like to finish with a positive message. I was in a seminar a few days ago, and the people were saying, we are techno-optimists, but socio-pessimists, because the political economy, and to a large extent, because of the legacy that neoliberal globalization has left, are tremendously difficult. But I found some comfort in this sentence by Albert Hirschman, who was working for the Marshall Plan after the Second World War, and he said that rather than dejectedly contemplating the operation of another dismal historical law, we are at hope successfully engaged in proving that those are those which ourselves accept and create. The great master and friend of Waldo Zunkel call for a sociocentric political economy in which the state leads and orientates private investment and is and respond in a transparent way to the society. And the last sentence is, I don't know who is the author. Some people said it's Eduardo Galeano, others said that it's Frei Beto. I'm not so sure, but it's save pessimism for better times. Because thank you very much.
Well, moving forward in our roundtable with Professor Castillo. It's your turn.
Well, hello. It's a great pleasure to be here in this conference. I would like first to thank Bruno Di Conti that invited me to participate in this group, and also congratulate everybody that was in the organization. And well, as Gabriel said, it's I feel at home, even if I've never studied here, but I came frequently here. And I would like also to quote Celso Furtado and ask you to forgive me for my French accent. Well, Another disclaimer, I'm not a specialist on finance. In fact, I work with trade and industrial policy. And then I'm going to make a presentation that's obviously related to all these discussions we had. In fact, I'm going to present some results from a project we are conducting at my research group at Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. That's about decarbonization and industrial policy, and where we've been trying to identify how industrial policy can contribute to decarbonization of the whole economy. We depart from an analysis of the instruments that are being used by other countries around the world. Also, we look at some sectors particularly to see challenges and possibilities. And then to discuss industrial policy instruments that might be mobilized to contribute to decarbonization. And at this time, obviously, finance is important. Fernanda is going to join us to learn, to teach us how to deal with that. And also the use of tax revenues if it arrives. Well, then I'm going to talk then about this project that's called Decarbonization. No. Okay, here. Yeah. But I think I'm more used to this. Let's. Then I'm going to present this opportunity and challenge for decarbonization in Brazilian industry. In fact, it's not in Brazilian industry and policy implications. In fact, what we are thinking about is which is the industrial policy, or which are the industrial policy instruments that can be used for the decarbonization of the whole economy. What I mean with that is that we are looking for industrial policy, but we are trying to affect not only industrial sectors, as we've said before, as it was said before. And despite the importance of industrial emissions, as Christina said, in absolute terms, for the whole economy, the problem is not good. But no. Okay. Then is our method is to use industrial policy instruments to affect the emissions of any sector. For example, we can think that influencing cars, the way we produce cars, or the way cars are produced, not the production itself, but the characteristics of the goods of the cars. It can influence one of the most one of the activities that are most that has more emissions, that is transportation services. Okay, and you are going to see that we look also at, for example, what we can do at a agro industry to try to influence the agriculture and the agriculture activity. Well, then we depart from a point that Camila insists, and Camila Gramco insists, and that I think it's well accepted, that there are challenges, but mainly opportunities in this transition. I mean, decarbonization can give us some opportunities. Yeah, we are based for our work. We are based both in some modeling, but a lot of sectoral and policy instrument studies to identify the relevant policy instruments and strategies. Well, the challenges, I think Porcile mentioned it already, and I will come quickly on that. And opportunities, we have the opportunities to have a new investment cycle, an important technological change, and some windows of opportunity. And I go directly to our conclusion, is that in both cases, a qualified state intervention is needed, not only to solve political conflicts, but mainly to coordinate state action and to induce public and private investment. Well, in terms of challenges, I think Porcile was more optimistic than I, and he didn't, he went directly to the goals. Well, we know that trying to induce decarbonization and trying to technologies, for example, that leads to decarbonization, it doesn't guarantee that we will have growth. But more than that, perhaps the biggest problem is the social inclusion and employment. Adopting green technologies, for example, doesn't guarantee that we will have growth, and neither perhaps more problematic employment and better social conditions. Then I think now it's what Porcile said. We might have, and Christina also, that we might have clearly, we might clearly state goals and objectives, and we make options to make the things together, to put the three dimensions together. And this is sometimes sometimes problematic. Well, when we look at, and then if we want to think about industrial policy, we might think what are the design of this industrial policy, and happily, the last years we saw a renewal of industrial policy, and then well, Trump has a lot of bad aspects. One aspect is that we don't need to make introductions or disclaimers for the use of industrial and trade policy instruments. Then I pass by, but the point is that industrial policy. We've looked at several several countries' experience on industrial policy for the decarbonization. And what we see is that we need to have policies and instruments that are very different depending on the sector, depending on the region, depending on very specific country characteristics. And then this is the first point. One size does not fit all. The second thing, I think, and it will be a conclusion, it will appear during all the presentation, is that we need specific and innovative state capabilities. I think Ana Celia will like this. And last, we might take into account the political economy of industrial policy, as we have a lot of political challenges, and there is something that's known since the beginning of the 2000, when we restarted to make industrial policy, that is the importance of coordination among the policy actors. Well, we have then, the project includes some sector studies. Here I bring 3 of them that are already published, that are the meat supply chain, cement supply chain, and steel supply chain. They are very different. There are very different challenges and policies and strategies that can be adopted to face these challenges. And then in meat supply chain, the main challenge is at the beginning of the supply chain. It's the land use with deforestation, reduction, and traceability being some requirements for increasing productivity, but also to enter international markets. And other, the reduction of methane depends of changes in habits of the population, but also livestock raising, changing methods, and also land use. Then here, regulation, but here the political will is a great problem. And then second sector, cement supply chain. Here, the main problem is the intensive use of energy. Even if we have quite clear energy, there are some, they are very intensive, but also in the composition of the cement itself. Then, but here, what we think about is that we have some policy instruments that can be mobilized to induce better performance, like public procurement. Minha Casa Minha Vida could, for example, induce better standards, and some policies associated to the industry organization, because in this sector, informality, in the sector of construction, building, informality is very high. And here, perhaps the carbon market can play an important role. Finally, steel supply chain. It's another hard to abate sector, and another characteristic of this sector is that this sector is passing by a huge crisis, economic crisis around the world because of the overcapacity related to the increase of Chinese, mainly to the increase of Chinese supply, sorry. But then the challenges are hard, are big. Then here you have also energy. The challenges are in the energy use, but also the input market. We have very little scrap in Brazil, and then the use, the improvement of scrap market and perhaps also the change of the second best energy, I mean natural gas, could be interesting for improving the conditions. Finally, a carbon market can be also something that could contribute. And finally, I would stress also the question of access to international markets, not only CBAM, but not only European CBAM, other CBAMs, but also this kind of international global crisis or oversupply in this sector. Well, this if you look. We think that in the three cases shows the necessity of specific state capabilities. If we look at the first regulation or the second carbon market, or even the public procurement, or at the third one, the questions of negotiating and dealing with other partners, international partners, all these are going to demand stronger state capabilities. And then to close, and I will try to come to these points. Well, we depart from a constatation that there are state activism, and it's okay, it's accepted, and obviously the challenges depends. One of the great challenges, and here I join the theme of the issues discussed here. The challenges, one of the main challenges is the limited available resources. How to finance green development. The decarbonization is a long-term task. We have the energy matrix is one positive. Is one positive aspect for Brazil, and we have some technological capacities in some areas. For example, this possible transfer of technology and how to do between offshore oil production to offshore wind capture. But the risk is what we discussed yesterday is the trap of specialization in commodities. Well, and then to finish the essential state capabilities, we have been looking. We have been, I think, living a very innovative and important innovations in policies in Brazil in general. And I think Cristina is here to show how, and it seems to be something positive, how the finance ministry integrates and assumes some some objectives that will require some financing. And then, and the last point, I think, has to do with also the democratic point raised by several one. Again, Porcile said, and this is a hope message for Argentinian. And we've lived to have strong state capabilities and then to have a strong bureaucracy. It helped us to survive in the Bolsonaro times. And then I think this is a very important thing to do, not only to conduce and organize these three dimensions Porcile said, social sustainability and economic goals, but also to be prepared for future times. Well, I will finish here. Thank you.
Well, it's working. Everybody listen. Okay. Okay, ending our great roundtable. We're moving forward to Lígia.
Thank you. Well, I have the ungrateful job of being the thing that separates you all from lunch. So let me try to stick to time. So I am actually going to be picking up from where Jayati left. I will have to go a little bit around before I get to the taxation point, but I will talk about taxation. But really, my motivation today here comes from the belief that the crisis that we're facing won't be solved through internal reforms of our system, and that the incremental changes that we are able to push for are delivering too little and too late. So as a feminist economist, an activist, and a Latin American economist, I have constantly felt frustrated with our inability to build solidarity across our struggles. And it is within the feminist movement that I am getting hope of building networks that we need, the networks that Jayati was mentioning. And I think taxation is also the low-hanging fruit on our capacity of building those networks, not only in the sense that it's the easiest thing we have and the most important thing to change at this point, but also it does create a lot of solidarity around it. So I am going to try to convince you all today that there is a huge missed opportunity in the climate finance agenda when the claims of feminist economists are not being incorporated and the care agenda is not being incorporated into the climate crisis agenda. So first, I am going to talk a little bit about how those two crises connect, the climate crisis and the care crisis, and then I'll move a little bit to what we're doing in terms of the financing care agenda and how it connects to the taxation agenda that Jayati already brought a lot of information on. So the first connection between those two crises is a more structural one. So when we think of our system, and this is something that I heard Jayati say a few years ago, and I have been using since, that our system is not gender biased, it's gender exploitative. And this is a very important point because also we've been treating the climate change as an externality or a market failure. It's not a failure, it is a feature of our system. So those two matters are connected in that sense. So the capital accumulation is itself contradictory with life sustenance. And this is part of our problem. So those two things need to be treated together when we think of what our system is failing at. And so the other connection between those two crises has to do with the fact that they are reinforcing each other. So if you think the climate crisis, it intensifies the care burden in many ways. So for example, the water supply, the food supply, the access to those resources, they are ever more difficult to get to. So it takes more time for women to collect water, for example, in rural areas. So this is disproportionately impacting communities that are already overwhelmed by their care responsibilities. On the other hand, the same thing happens with the care crisis, reinforcing the climate crisis, because it undermines climate resilience. So certain sustainable practices, organic farming, recycling, reforestation, they're mostly being done by women, and women that are very tight on time and suffering from time poverty. So the exploitation of human capacity directly limits our ability to heal the natural system as well, and to continue the reproduction of life. And there is also another matter of those two crises, which is the fact that they both have a global scale. It's fairly easy to think of the climate crisis as a global scale crisis, but the care crisis as well has been a global scale crisis, as you see how our care chains have been working and how labor in global south are being exploited in ways to be used in global north as well. And inequality in the global south is also a way of maintaining a certain level of being and well-being in the global north. So there is a colonial contradiction here, and the system has been solving its crisis by exporting those crises to the periphery itself. And we cannot, I'm not going to go too long on this point, but we cannot really think of the European welfare state, which is such a reference for us. We think of Sweden, for example, and this is what we need to be. It's not disconnected of our inability of being it. So the fact that Sweden can have the welfare state that it has also to do with the fact that Brazil cannot have the welfare state that we want. So we need to think of those colonial ties. And the same is happening with the green transition, because mostly we do see a lot of push to implement certain policies that are just being imported from the global north. So in the global south, and especially in Brazil, and this is something that I really appreciate Marta's work for, because she's really thinking on what is it that we need from a Brazilian perspective in terms of deal with the climate crisis. We do not have an energy crisis. It's not a problem of renewable energies. It's a very different type of problem. We have a problem with land use. We have a problem with deforestation and so on. So the solutions that need to be implemented here have nothing to do with, for example, an electric fleet. They have to do with many different things. And actually, electric fleets are creating other problems in terms of the mining that is happening in Latin America as well. So now so given this background of how those two things connect, I want to also take a little bit as to the current context we have, and this will connect a little bit with what Gabriel was mentioning, which has to do with our limited fiscal space and where austerity has put us today. So austerity has really changed the way we look at budgets. So we have moved the conversation from what is the state that we want to have, what is it, what are the rights that people, that the government is going to deliver to people, to a matter of not spending that much. So this kind of fiscal straitjackets has been a political tool to protect capital by blocking the logical response, public investment in care and climate adaptation, restricting the state abilities to support life. So we can think of the fiscal policy as a social pact that has been agreed through a constitution, and that has written down what is it that us as a society have agreed on that will be financed by the government, and it also puts there who is going to be paying for that. So we have on the one hand our tax systems, and on the other hand our expenditure part of our fiscal policy, and those are part of this social pact that has been completely transformed by austerity policies, and in Brazil specifically by our fiscal rules. So there is a shrinking pool of funds because of austerity, and another another thing that this is doing to us is that it's creating even more contradiction between the different agendas. So there is more conflict between the different policies. So instead of us thinking of what is the state we want, we have been moved into what is the priorities of our state. And those priorities, we've been talking a lot about that, how our constitution does not fit our budget anymore in Brazil. This is the way we've been looking at the fiscal rules. It has created that situation that we need to choose between universal healthcare or universal public education or a pension system. So it is not anymore of how the state's going to deliver those things that it can do, but what is it, how do we prioritize to maintain a certain budget alignment? And this, unfortunately, when we think of what are the most pressing issues, care is always coming last. So this has created especially a problem for the gender agenda and the gender inequality fighting policies. Because if it is going to be a matter of priority, we know every time, again, gender will going to lose that fight. So as our budget becomes more and more a fight between the contradictory agendas, the more we see that we're going to be reinforcing those care crises. And there is also a greenwashing risk when we don't take those two things together. So the way we've been seeing this is that the green agenda has been winning over the type of financing that it happens. And in not thinking concretely together a green agenda with what we can call a purple agenda, for example, many feminists have been calling it that way, a green-purple agenda, we end up with a green agenda that is empty, that is just going to deliver more inequalities. So really what I'm claiming for here is integrating those two models together and thinking of those things together. The silver lining that I've been seeing of austerity is that it has forged this unified political front for taxation. It has forced everyone working on some social agenda or on the green agenda to to not only defend their policies, but also to need to say, where will the money come from? So it has pushed us into this finance agenda. And as Jayati has mentioned, the low-hanging fruit on that is taxation. So what I do observe is that taxation became this political force. And I think Brazilians here have been seeing that lately with the PL that is being pushed in the Congress, where they are trying to implement a taxation, a minimal tax for the super rich in Brazil in the personal taxation. There has been a very big change in the discourse on that. So this has been something that we have observed on the national level, but also on the international level. And Brazil has had a very important role on that, not only on the national level, but as well last year as the G20 presidency, where the Gabriel Zucman 2% international minimum wealth taxation really was being pushed strongly by Brazil and by the finance minister in Brazil. So, and the importance of this becoming an international agenda is, even though there is a lot that can already be done within our national tax reform. So Brazil has a very regressive tax system. We're not taxing the rich enough. There is a lot of room to really get more resources from those very rich. But there is also a limited amount of funds that we will get from that. And it's not every country that it will be able to gather the funds they need to fight climate change and to reinforce their care policies just through internal tax reform. So this really pushes us into an international agenda. And one of the problems we have with taxation and within the global South countries is the fact that, so in the one hand, because we're extremely unequal, we are the ones mostly depending on state social protection policies and so on. So we are the ones that really need a state that is more present and that is delivering more, which means they need more resources. We are also the ones most feeling the climate crisis. So most of the emergencies that are going to be happening in the next few years, they are also based on those countries that are the ones that are already the most unequal. On the other hand, those countries are the ones that have the least leverage for tax revenues, exactly because of this inequality. So what inequality does as well on a tax system is that it really creates a very narrow tax base. So we cannot start taxing people, for example, at the 50% of our pyramid. We really only start taxing people at the very rich. And because of political forces of inequality as well, it also makes it harder for us to tax heavily on the top. So this really creates also an inequality kind of cycle where taxation is the most important tool for us to be able to use, but also it wouldn't be enough, and we are not politically strong enough to enforce the type of taxation that we need. So we have regressive systems. We depend a lot on indirect taxes, and we are not taxing enough the rich. How do we change that? We really do need some kind of international cooperation. So, and then moving a little bit to what I guess Jayati already mentioned a lot of what has been done, and the fact that many of the conversations on taxation on a global level have up to now been happening at OECD with the BEPS solutions, the two-pillar solution. But there is really a huge movement that we observe in Latin America and across the world among feminist economists to push for a more democratic forum for us to really start move the tax conversation to a more democratic forum as the UN. So the UN tax framework has gained a lot of momentum as well with the Brazilian G20 presidency, and I believe that the Latin American as well with the PETELAC, as Jayati also mentioned. So this was a platform for taxation that was led by Colombia a couple of years ago, that also brought together a lot of people, and that was pushed as well to support this move from the forum on OECD to a forum on the UN, and moving taxation to that. And one thing that I find very interesting, because another problem that we're having right now on mobilizing around taxes is the fact that the state is under attack in general. So people like, why will I pay taxes to a corrupt state to come and do what? And this is a very huge problem we have in Latin America. So, I mean, when I do slides, I always put this image, so I'm just going to describe it. But Sérgio Chaparro, who is a lawyer from the Tax Justice Network, has this amazing graph that he has put together. So in the one hand, you have the map of the world with the corruption perception index. So you see all red in the global south. And on the other hand, you have the tax abuse countries, and you see all red on the global north side. So this has also been, so this inability of us making the state be believed in Latin America is also part of a global discourse on the incapacity of the state, when it is really global north countries using legal ways of taking resources out of the south and building those, you know, amazing welfare states that we all want to have, and we believe we can't have because our governments are so corrupt. And it's not that simple. So we really need to push forward with that. And I think there is a way of mobilizing around that agenda. So, just to finish, I believe there is like really a great momentum, this overlapping crisis and the erosion of the state ability to fight those crises is building a momentum for a certain popular movement and for people really claiming for something different. People are really tired of the kind of economy that we have. But on the other hand, what I have been observing, and this is very clear with the CARE agenda, is that where the state is leaving vacuum, we are seeing other forces entering. So we have religious institutions delivering care to the population. We have paramilitary institutions delivering care to the population, for example. And this is also eroding our capacity of believing in the state. So bringing the care agenda and delivering that to people would be very important, because we're not talking about something abstract or a possible crisis that will happen in a few years that depend on people believing in science. We're really talking about something that is daily affecting people's life, their incapacity of taking take care of the children, their lack of time to eat properly, the food insecurity they are feeling, all of that are things that really relate to their life in a level that no other agenda can. So what I'm claiming today is that really anyone working on the tax agenda, of course, but also on the climate agenda and the financing climate agenda, please bring the gender lenses to your analysis. And the feminist economists, we are doing a lot, and we are reaching out to everyone. And somehow we don't see even the economics community reaching out back to us. So the heterodox people are not reaching out to the feminist economists that are really using those kind of economics that we've learned with heterodox economics. So I just hope I can get more colleagues here to work together with me. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much for your presence. We are very honored you all are here.